Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cybersecurity and ISO 27001, Implementing a Secure Information Security Management System, presented jointly today by NQA and the DESARA Group. My name is Karen Rawson, and I'm the Vice President of the DESARA Group. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. And I'll be introducing Tim Whitcomb in just a minute. Our other presenter, Dave Santacola, couldn't be with us today. So I'll just go ahead and introduce the DESARA Group for starters. By the way, if you look on the handouts portion of your pull-down menu on the GoToWebinar page, GoToWebinar panel, you'll see that you can pull down a workbook that you can use today as we go through the presentation to take notes. And there's also copies of the presentation, either PDF or PowerPoint if you'd like to take notes on that. And also you'll get a recording of the webinar afterwards. This is being recorded. And one last thing before we go any further, I want to mention, add your questions to the questions tab on the GoToWebinar panel today so that we can answer those at the end. My company, the DESARA Group, is a consulting company that helps companies get to the point of being ready for certification and then to grow into their certification to continually improve. And the ways we do that are we have a management systems implementation program where we take companies through ISO 27001 as well as related standards in quality and aerospace and telecommunications on the quality side. And then we also participate in internal audits. We can do those for you in a turnkey fashion. We can do your initial gap assessment or your readiness assessment before certification. And we do investigations when things go wrong to go in and say where within the system did things actually fall apart, whether for a quality or information security standpoint. And we do supplier audits and your ongoing internal audits, but mainly our sweet spot is helping companies implement management systems. It's something we enjoy doing, and later in the presentation, I'll share with you how we do that. But next, I'd like Tim Whitcomb from NQA to introduce himself.
Sure. Thanks, Karen. And we'll be seeing the slides here momentarily, but I work for NQA. We are a certification body. And among the many products or services that we offer, ISO 27001 would be one of those certifications. So as Karen mentioned, once an organization implements with a consultant potentially or by themselves potentially, implements a management system like ISO 27001, normally they would engage with the certification body to come conduct the independent audits and then ultimately issue the certification, the accredited certification. So NQA is one of those auditing firms or certification bodies. We're accredited by ANAB here in the US. We also hold other accreditations around the globe like UCAS throughout EMEA primarily. NQA also has offices in the APAC region and throughout the European states. We've been doing this for roughly 30 years, and that, of course, goes back to the ISO 9001 days, which was kind of the initial management system that was out there. 27,000, of course, is much younger than that, but we've been doing 27,000 work since the early days. And at this point, we've got probably northwards of 40,000 clients or certifications that we work with globally, and that, again, is across the multitude of standards, 9001 being a big percentage of them. But increasingly, some of the things that kind of highlighted here at the bottom, 27001 for information security. Also related to that would be 20,000 for IT service management, and then business continuity management systems under 22301. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Now everyone can see the slides, right? Is that right, Tim? You can see my slides? Good deal. I apologize for that. I'm going to turn off the video now. And I suppose Tim will do the same so that we make sure that we get the best quality feed for the presentation and best sound quality. I'll tell you about the presentation today. We're going to talk a little bit up front about what is information security and why is it important. And then in the orange there, we'll get into the bulk of this presentation is about ISO 27001 requirements and the special section of this standard, Annex A, that has what they call controls, which are the methods by which you protect your information assets. So This is the bulk of the presentation is about the requirements of ISO 27001, and then we'll talk about implementing it, and Tim will come back on the line to talk about certifying to ISO 27001 and what it's like to work with NQA, and then we'll take questions at the end. Now, some people think of information security as the purview of the IT folks. But actually, there are a number of different functions within an organization who definitely need to understand what options are out there and what ISO 27001 would ask of you in implementing a management system. For example, senior managers are the ones who would make the decisions on resourcing to protect information assets, and senior managers are all about avoiding risks and capitalizing on opportunities. So senior managers need to understand the current models and trends in information security management, especially the point that it's not just for IT. But of course, IT people need to understand the ISO 27001 standard because while they're already recognizing and responding to risks in the information systems, such as the computers on which everything is stored, how information moves around, the networks and so forth, IT leaders tend to understand that they can't fill all the gaps and all the leaks that can happen with information leaking out. It requires a full organization approach at all levels, as do the people on the technical staff who may need to make changes in the ways that they operate, the ways that they do their jobs in order to protect information both inside the company as well as information that goes out in products or exchanges with customers and suppliers. It's important that the technical staff see the big picture and not just pay attention to their own little corner of where information is used. Now, for an NQA and for the DESARA group, we both tend to work a lot with companies who are pursuing quality certifications like ISO 9001. And if you came into this presentation after a background in ISO 9001, you're about to hear about how many of your experiences, the skills that you've gained, such as internal audit and so forth, can be leveraged to help develop and maintain the information security management system, the ISMS. So quality professionals, you can definitely make the going a little easier based on your experiences here. Sales professionals are often the ones that bring ISO 27001 as a requirement into the business because they find customers who say either get certified at ISO 27001 or answer this list of 80 questions about how you handle things and let us come in and audit you about how you do that. Some companies have gotten along for many years without getting certified to ISO 9001 based on contractual negotiations and also how you explain to your customers how you do things. But more and more, it'll be a competitive advantage and later on simply table stakes to have your certification in place. It'll put you ahead of the competition at this point, I think, in many different industries. The reason information security is important to a business is that you need to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your information. Imagine what would happen to your business if your confidential business information or the private personal information of your employees or information about your customers or even your suppliers that you wouldn't want to get out there made it out into some place that did damage to the business. So it's critical when we think of information security that we keep private things private, secret things secret, and that we avoid the potential of damaging anyone in the use of information by getting it into the wrong hands. Integrity is the second main area that information security management systems want to address. For example, if you're trying to solve a problem and you can't get access to the information because it's been lost, it's been corrupt, it's been deleted when you didn't expect it to be, or someone's got into it and changed it when it shouldn't be changed, you've got either malicious or unintentional changes to information that you want, you can't do your job. It could potentially cost the company a lot of money and at a minimum is probably going to be a big inconvenience. Often when I talk to people about their information security, how they deal with the availability of information, like if there's a snowstorm or a fire or something that you can't get to work, they would say, oh, well, we just work from home. Everything is duplicated, stuff is up in the cloud, and we can work from there. But what if the equipment that gets you to the data that you need to use is threatened, is not available. So availability goes not just to the information itself, but to the means that you go about getting to that information. Availability of information is critical to being able to do your job. And I think the area that we all consider when we think of information security, we think of hackers getting into the product or getting into our business systems that could corrupt or compromise or leverage our information for their own nefarious purposes. Anytime you get somebody else monkeying around with your business, you are at risk of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So those are the three aims of an information security management system. And as I've said those things, you've probably thought about all the steps that your own company has taken to address the risks to your information and how it's processed. But let's talk about how companies that have an information security management system, an ISMS, in place, how do they go about facing risks? Well, if you have an ISMS, off the top, you need to have your management team involved from the very beginning, setting the goals and measurements and providing the resources to make sure the work gets done, and also listening to and responding to the analysis and treatment of risks. For example, if you find, oh my gosh, we've got some outdated equipment and applications here that we need to upgrade, you need to evaluate those and say, is it worth fixing them? Is it, what's the risk if this information were compromised in some way? And if it's worthy of fixing, treating those risks, going forward in a systematic way. So it's not just a squeaky wheel gets the grease, but more of a what's the biggest risk to us, and we work on that stuff first, or the higher risk items go to the top of the list. In a company with an ISMS, an important aspect of running a system and improving it is to learn from your mistakes. So whenever there's a breach or a potential breach of information, of the security of your information, a management system expects that you do systematic investigations and corrections going back to the cause of any security incidents and events. And that you have change management in place if you are certified at 27001, so that when you make a change, you're sure it actually works. You're not rolling back 2 days later and people are tearing their hairs out, or you can't even roll back because no one put that into place. I mean, imagine if my first experience with that was with Y2K, 18 years ago, almost 19 years ago, when we changed over to the year 2000. How do we make sure that all our systems work under the new date structure? Companies with an ISMS evaluate how effective their system is, and they work their management system not just through IT, but company-wide. Now, I keep talking about information security and information security management systems, but your company may use the term cybersecurity. Some people believe that information security is a subset of cybersecurity, and other people believe it's the other way around. So I just ask that today you don't get hung up on cybersecurity versus information security, even though those two words are used in different standards. We're talking in general about protecting the information assets that are important to your company, whether they are on computers or out in the cloud someplace and you don't even know where they are, or whether they're on your own, whether they're in your own head or on your desktop in printed material. Just the point being of an information security management system that you protect the information that you need in order to be a successful business. So imagine if your business had a breach of some kind. We've all heard of breaches like this, like Starwood Hotels just had a breach of their reservation system, and everyone's passwords and email and other information, including some passport information, was exposed. I think it's been a couple of years now. Target had one where their point of sale devices were compromised. And of course, everyone on this call can probably mention something that would happen in their company that would be a damage to reputation or would lead to lost sales, either short-term or long-term, or would at least cost their business some money to clean up the mess or cause you to scramble in some way. But the risk isn't just to your own company when there's some sort of information security problem. It may be that your customers aren't able to get their orders filled, and that could affect their customers. Or maybe their sensitive information is exposed and they have a long-term impact and a cost to clean up the mess. And then there's the public impact. You have no idea how far your information security risk could go to affect someone else out in the public, even in terms of lack of trust in systems of your company, customers, your industry. If we have information security problems in business, eventually, if our voluntary controls and business practices don't stand up, regulators will get involved and will be required to answer to regulatory controls like HIPAA, what we do in the medical field with our medical records being stored properly, or SOX, where we Sarbanes-Oxley Act, where we protect financial information of publicly traded companies. Lately, you've probably heard about GDPR. It probably came out back in May, all the different newsletters you were on that would say, do you accept our communications? That's a European and EU regulation. Up until companies adopt a standard like ISO 27001, often it's just customer requirements that come across in contracts, or business decisions about how IT thinks things ought to run, or how facilities decides to lock things down, various practices that the business will put on itself to avoid having regulators come in and regulate the industry. But ISO 27001 is actually a standard that has so many of the best practices of industry encompassed in it that you can use that model to make sure you have a systematic approach as opposed to an ad hoc approach or something driven only by the IT department to protect your information. And now the next part of the presentation is to go over ISO 27001, what it is, what it says, how it looks like ISO 9001 in some ways if you've dealt with other standards on the quality side, and then we'll get into what does it take to implement it. And at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Tim Woodcomb from NQA to talk about what's included in the standard. Tim?
Thanks, Karen. So I think Karen did a great job of kind of setting the stage and putting out the value proposition of why an information security management system, why ISO 27001. So I want to take a little bit of time now to talk about the structure of the standard. And for those of you that I'm sure there's many on the call are already familiar with ISO management systems, be it ISO 9000 or any of the other management system derivatives. A lot of this is going to be old hat. ISO 27001 is built in that same model. It is just another variation or another flavor, if you will, of a management system. Albeit with the objective, and this is coming right from the preface of the standard, to preserve that confidentiality, integrity, and information availability that Karen mentioned with regards to information or cybersecurity. One of the main tenets of the standard, and the way that we'll see the controls roll out a little bit later, is through a risk management approach. And certainly, again, those folks in the know will recognize that yes, risk management has been brought into the 9001 standard through risks and opportunities and such. 27001 and its approach to risk management predated that, but more importantly, I think it takes a more truer approach to risk management, a more academic approach, if you will. And again, Karen's already kind of alluded to some of that in terms of practices of identifying risks, identifying treatments, i.e. controls, as they'll play out as we go through this. At the end of the day, certification to 27001 certainly provides a level of confidence to interested parties. We'll see also that there are tie-ins to supply chain and supplier expectations or flow down, if you will, and that might be what some folks are seeing or hearing for themselves. And ultimately, this standard is the basis for that ISO certification that a lot of organizations are looking to achieve these days. It is related to a family of ISO 27000 additional documents. Again, as is the case with most ISO standards, in addition to the requirements, there's a guidance document that is kind of the companion, and a series of other documents that you may be interested as you go down the path. Like most management systems, again, it's going to be set up in kind of a circular I'll say plan, do, check, act, although they technically drop those phrases out of the latest iteration of the standard. I think what they kind of use now would be an establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve type approach. And you can break down the standard, or at least the requirements, into that kind of circular wheel. So primarily what I'm talking about here would be what I'll refer to, what we'll refer to as the requirements of the standard. And that would be, again, kind of the ISO shalls, if you will. We'll talk about the controls, which are a little bit different and certainly unique within 27000 in the later segment here. But as far as the requirements go, you'll see a lot of similarity for those folks, again, that are familiar with 9001. You've got requirements to establish a scope, objectives, the policies, all within the context of the organization and related to interested parties. Then go forth and implement those policies, procedures. Ultimately, it boils down to controls, have the right resources to do so, the right competencies to do so, and so on and so forth. That obviously gets maintained. You operate according to those policies, to those procedures, in a systematic manner, in a consistent manner. And that's a lot of what the third-party audit looks at to confirm that you're doing that, to attest to that, if you will. And then, as with any management system, it kind of rounds itself out with the concepts of looking to continually improve. So how do you monitor the system? We'll see internal audit, we'll see management review, corrective action, and ultimately those improvements might beget things that you change in terms of establishing and implementing, and that circle goes on and on. So as Karen mentioned, the 27001 standard, like information security, is meant to be an organizational approach, not just IT. And that's one of the main differentiators, I think, between this and a lot of the other, I'll call them cyber standards out there. This brings in that organizational approach, the holistic approach. So a lot of emphasis on the processes and the people, probably as much, if not perhaps more so, than the actual hardware or software or IT controls that get you there. This is just another kind of graphical portrayal, if you will, of the standard. And again, in the blue box would be the requirements. So like most, pretty much all ISO management system standards at this point, these would be the sections 4 through 10 that a lot of folks are familiar with. NQA is what we're going to talk about in the next segment, and that's where the controls come in. And I'm sure folks have kind of heard about the controls. In 27001, NQA is a set of 100+ controls that are at least prescribed in terms of having the organization take a review of those. They need not all necessarily be implemented or determined to be applicable, and that's where we'll get into where the organization can define what is applicable and what's not. But NQA is also not meant to be the only set of controls or the be-all, end-all. So things like the GDPR that Karen mentioned, things like NIST 800-171, two of the hotter topics, if you will, depending on which industry you're in. Those certainly could be other controls that are considered within and brought in under an ISO 27001 ISMS. And then kind of rounding this out, again, kind of talked around this, but in the sampling of requirements of the shall statements within the standard, again, see a lot of familiarity for anyone that's got an Annex SL type standard already in place, starting with interested parties. Context of the organization is in there. Obviously, Section 5 has a lot of requirements on leadership. So like any management system standard, it starts at the top. You need the leadership buy-in, you need their participation, you need that top management activity, and that is more or less as you'd see in the other management system standards. Objectives come forth. Of course, now we're going to get a little more specific and make sure that they're related to information security objectives. But the same thoughts are there in the standard, the same requirements are there in the standard in terms of defining plans of how you're going to meet those objectives. Competencies, communications, awarenesses, all those are part and parcel of the standard, as is documented information. For the most part, like with most, say, current or modern ISO standards, less and less emphasis on specific procedures, although you will see certain specific procedures being required. Some of those come out in the requirements, more of them frankly come out in the controls. But more and more so, we're focused on records or artifacts, if you will, as being the documented information in 27001. Two unique requirements, if you will, of the set in 27001 come up next, and that being the information security risk assessment and risk treatment. We've already highlighted that, but that's, again, kind of a unique tenet of 27001, the idea that you would take more of an academic approach to risk management here, identify the information security risks you've got, identify risk treatments, which again kind of tie into the controls that we'll go over momentarily. And then as far as the management system, it kind of rounds out again, as you'd expect, with internal audit requirements, which are more or less as you'd expect. Management review requirements, again, the same. Corrective action, continual improvement requirements. That would be what you've come to know in other management systems.
Tim keeps mentioning the word controls, and we're going to talk now about what do we mean by the controls, these 114 controls that are in Annex A of ISO 27001. So you get through the basic clauses that he just described, the establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve your management system. Well, the controls that are added are like the bricks in the wall that you put up in front of those things that you want to protect. So you would have a number of steps that you would take for the various kinds of assets that you want to protect. And when I say assets, I mean anything from servers that your stuff runs on, to documents that you may need to keep control of, to physical premises where you need to be sure that people aren't coming and going when they're not supposed to be, and certainly how your network works with other other companies, inside your internal and external networks work. Well, ISO 27001 divided all these different types of bricks that you can put in the wall, the types of steps that you can take to control for the threats that face your that 1 through 4 are not used. They just started with the number 5 to keep it consistent with some other documents that are out there. And Tim and I will go back and forth on describing just briefly what's in each of these domains, each of the 14 groupings of different types of things that you would do to make sure that your information security management system protects your assets. And domain 5 is information security policies, and it starts right at the top, that management has to establish those policies to direct and support information security. They have to take into account not only what customers and the business needs, but also the relevant laws and regulations. This is something that you may have legal people inside your company who help support and identify where the laws and regulations are. And if you don't, you need to have a system set up. If you don't have lawyers, where are you getting your information about which laws affect you where you live? For example, how did your company have any idea whether the GDPR regulations that a lot of companies dealt with would have any effect on you? That should have been on somebody's radar screen if you had an information security management system in place. And Tim, domain 6?
Yep, so domain 6, titled, as you see there, Organization of Information Security. I think both domains 5 and 6 are kind of a good segue from the requirements into the controls, because 5 and 6 are a little more policy-based, a little more document-based. Some of the controls in 6 talk about the information security roles and responsibilities, the segregation of those duties. It requires organizations to consider or have policies around contact with authorities or contact with special interest groups. It talks about program management, or rather project management, and information security aspects within that. And then it goes on to talk about some 2 very specific kind of common events, or common considerations, if you will. Having a mobile device policy. So obviously everyone has a mobile device these days, and it's certainly not just a phone. It breaches on computer. So what are the policies around that? Because you certainly could be having information come over your mobile device. So it's not just the PC or laptop you're working on, but any mobile devices. And then teleworking, as alluded to in one of the examples for availability. You may certainly have teleworking policies within your organization today. If not today, then certainly probably in the near future. So what are the policies around that relative to information security? So most of the controls in section 6, again, more policy, but we'll start to get more technical as we go down in the next few.
Well, domain 7 is another one that's not terribly technical. It's things that most people would, if you sat down and said, where are our risks associated with the people who are doing work with us? You'd say, well, we've got risks before we hire them, during their employment, and then after they leave. So before you hire somebody, there's a control in domain 7 about screening your people who will be working with you, background verification checks to be sure that they are worthy of the trust that you put in them to access your systems and potentially your customers and suppliers interactions as well. And that they sign off on terms and conditions of employment. So you have some control over who you bring in. And then while they're employed, there are requirements for everyone to understand and abide by the policies and procedures. And then should someone leave the company or leave the group that they're working on, what are the steps that you take to protect the information that they previously had access to, or the computers or anything that they had access to when they change roles or leave the company entirely? Tim, Domain 8?
Domain 8, asset management, starts to get a little heavier and a little more technical. This actually breaks down into 10 individual controls. And it ranges from information classification in terms of how different types of levels of security, if you will, or level of control relative to that information, labeling that information, ultimately how the various assets will be handled. Talks about media and different media types. Again, the removable media, having a specific policy or procedure on that. Kind of related to removable media, or I guess any really type, disposal thereof, and the physical transfer of media. The asset management part at the front really is kind of as you'd expect, taking an inventory of the various assets you've got, determining who owns those, what's the acceptable use of them, and then similar to with the media, the return of those assets if and when that time comes. So as you'd expect with asset management, but then talking very specifically about classifications and some aspects of media handling.
And there's an example with asset management in the next domain, access control. Those are both examples of areas where the policies and setup of how are we going to protect our information comes up right in the face of every employee who works there. For example, under Domain 8, when it was talking about asset management and classification of assets, handling media, people need to know, is this something that's highly confidential or proprietary that we can't get out, and we need to label it and handle it in a certain way, as opposed to something that would be public facing or easily shared with other people that have a need to know. Access control is where you have your permission to get in and out of certain applications, in and out of different management system, different computer systems, and who has the rights to apply that access control. And is the access control reviewed on a periodic basis so that anybody who may have previously had access is not still maintaining access that they don't need to have. So your business needs to decide who should have the controls to grant access, and then who actually gets access, and make sure that you don't have people getting into, like, everybody has access to the same shared directory, even though they may not need the information that's in there. And 10, cryptography, Tim.
Cryptography is a nice short set of controls. It's broken down into 2 sub-controls, very simply, having a policy on the use of cryptographic controls, and then key management, or management of those cryptographic keys. And of course, those could be rolled into one policy, so it could even boil down into one document. But this is, again, one of those areas that you would probably expect to have a document for. It talks about having a policy established. And this is, again, where it kind of gets a little more onto the IT side, but certainly people would need to be aware of the policy as applicable. And I think, the past couple of sections give good examples where we talked about this being a holistic example. So everything from the HR to the personnel to, some of these policy awarenesses certainly start to give it a flavor of being that holistic approach.
I'm sorry to cut you off there, Tim. I had a little glitch in my audio there, and I wasn't sure if you were done. Domain 11 on physical and environmental security are often the things that you've already been aware of no matter where you work in the company. Maybe you have a badge to get in and out of doors, or certain doors are locked and people can't get into them, server rooms are locked up. But under this domain, out of 114 controls, this area of physical and environmental security has 15 different sub-clauses on what they mean. Everything from perimeter security, making sure that people can't cut the cables going in and out of your building, making sure doors are locked, and making sure that external threats such as natural disasters and malicious attack and accidents can't affect your system. There are controls within 11 for where you put your equipment and how you make sure you've got utilities set up to provide access. For example, if you require 24/7 access to your systems, for example, you've got a help desk at the site, do you have a backup generator? Do you have more than one source of power or telecommunications coming into the building in case one route is cut out? So there are a number of controls here that are handled by facilities, some that are handled by IT, and most of them have some policies and so forth. So that actually, with information security, sometimes the biggest risk comes, or a source of major risk comes from the people who are using the information and people who already have access to it, whether maliciously or unintentionally. And this set of controls makes sure that just the physical access to the ability to access information are in place. Tim?
Domain 12 kind of takes that to the next step, and we're getting pretty heavy IT at this point. Another heavier set of controls, 14 sub-controls within this domain of operation security. And it kind of runs the gamut from requiring documented procedures in some cases for these things, but getting down to change management, capacity management issues, protection against malware, backups, event logging, monitoring, getting into software controls, clock synchronization, the management of technical vulnerabilities, and finally the audit of controls within the organization itself, which could again be part and parcel of the internal audit requirement under the requirement section. But whereas it would expect it to be a little more technical, it may or may not be exactly one and the same. So a lot of stuff within section 12, a lot of requirements and a lot of heavier or more important requirements. And certainly now we're pretty strong into the IT component of the controls.
And at this point, going into domain 13, which is also domain 13 and 14, 12, 13, and 14 are all very heavy on the IT side. When you look at the Appendix A of ISO 27001, it just gives not much more than Tim and I are giving right now. It'll be for example, Control 13.1. The title is Network Controls, and the control says networks shall be managed and controlled to protect information in systems and applications. Now that doesn't tell you anything about how to do it, what they mean by that, or how it would be audited. Your network information security management professionals will know what that means. But even just to make sure they get to the best practices on all of these things that are really IT, well, actually on all the controls, there's a related standard called ISO 27002. It's much longer. It's a couple hundred pages instead of a couple of dozen, and it covers all of the. It's the guidance document that says, well, when we say control for network security, these are among the best the things that are in place to control network security. So this is how do you make sure that when you're transferring information across a network, rather than just keeping something in your own hard drive, your own computer, your own desktop, how do you make sure that there are no security breaches as stuff is flying through the networks? Domain 14 for Tim.
Yep, and I think I've got 14 and 15, so I'll just roll into both of them. But 14 first talks about system acquisition, development, and maintenance. So this is kind of thinking at that 50,000 foot level, I suppose. You know, if you're looking to acquire a new system or make some changes to your existing system, what are the information security controls relative to that? So it kind of falls under the banner of planning. So you don't just want to hope that information security happens, but how do you plan for it in the acquisition of a new system? If you happen to be under development and are developing some of your systems or your controls. What type of security development policy do you have? When anything gets changed, what are the security requirements there? Do you need to go through and retest that? And that could evolve as to whether you yourselves are doing the development or whether that's outsourced. And we'll talk about supplier and supply chain stuff in domain 15, but you get kind of a preview of it in 14, where outsourced development should certainly have controls. And then with any development cycle, you'd expect as well testing and acceptance controls, but again, here focused on information security expectations or requirements. And as you see, domain 15 is that supplier relationship. So this is where the standard of the controls starts to create a flow down, if you will. And perhaps some of the folks on the phone have felt this flow down with their customers inquiring as to your information security posture or your certifications or what have you. The controls in 15 talk about information security with supplier relationships relative to having, first and foremost, a policy on that. And that would be, again, one of those documented policies that would be explicitly required. What would be the security expectations within supplier agreements, and how is that going to be monitored and reviewed? And similarly, when things change, how will that be addressed? So this might be the hook that have gotten some of you into this. It might also be the hook that you flow down to your suppliers, because I think, as we all know, everyone's weakest link in the chain may not be in-house, it may be downstream in your supply chain. So you need to consider that as well, and they're the controls.
Now, domain 16, information security incident management, may sound just like, oh, you have to have a correct security. You don't exactly want to publish that on a company-wide corrective action database, right? And you also don't want to tell your boss about it, because maybe it's something your boss is doing that's sneaky. So what they did in domain 16 is they said you need to set up incident management around information security incidents, so that when something happens, it gets reported to the right people to actually investigate, respond to it, and learn from the incidents to improve the system. Let me give you an example of this. Last week, I was doing an internal audit of a company that's not yet in ISO 27001 certified. They're on their way there. And when I walked in the building, the receptionist, who works for the building rather than for my client, handed us badges that, when I looked at it, it said level 4 security, no escort required. This can't be. You don't just give a complete stranger access to come in, and I mean, that ought to be like reserved for the president. Sure enough, I walked through several doors and realized I could get into all of the electronic doors in the building, including the data center where the most sensitive devices were held. So I alerted my client to this, just to see what they would say about, just to see how they would handle it. It was a little test within the audit that was created as soon as we walked in the door. Well, they immediately got facilities over, who's responsible for issuing badges and working with building management on how those were distributed, and they collected up the badges that we shouldn't have and gave us the right ones that we should have. So you might think, okay, well, they took care of the immediate problem, but what if that was something that receptionist didn't know any better then? Where was the training of, I mean, you'd consider them a supplier to this management, to this system, that the company that was certified or about to be certified. And so they are required to have the appropriate competence and understand all the controls that are relevant to them for letting people in and out of the building. Was that actually fixed? And then was it simply an oversight on somebody's problem, or was it the way things normally happen? So we didn't get that far into the investigation. But the next step I did as part of the audit, and this is actually the way auditors will often audit, is something will happen in the morning and they just kind of follow the thread through the course of the day. So each group that I interacted with, and even some people I talked to as I walked around, just asking them about, random things like, were they keeping their, checking to see if their doors were locked or screens were clear when they left their desk. I said, well, if this happened to you, if you had a visitor come into the building and get issued an all access badge, what would you do? And they said they'd do the same thing that my host in the audit did this morning. which was simply hand it over to the facilities people and ask them to take care of it. Well, the problem there is you may never get to the root cause of the problem, and maybe it was something that was systemic rather than just an oversight. An information security incident management system keeps the secret information secret so other people can't exploit that leak as long as it's open, and it makes sure that incidents actually get closed out and the system is improved as a result of it. So if you have a working corrective action system in place, you're part of the way there towards doing information security incident management, but you probably need to augment it with the security experts and the confidentiality around any of that information that's reported. Just thought I'd throw in there a little anecdote about something that just happened, though we don't have time to do that on all the different controls. And Tim,
All right,
you
and the
want to
last domain I'll talk about is 17, information security aspects of business continuity management. So business continuity, kind of alluding to, again, if you can't operate as business as usual. So whether it's a disaster or a crisis, as the picture kind of alludes to, a building on fire not accessible, whether it's a weather-related event, whether it's an employee-related event. The intent here and the controls really are pretty simple. It's planning, information security, continuity, implementing, reviewing, and evaluating information security continuity, and then an adjunct control for redundancies. Again, the intent there in all four of those cases really is in the case of being under that adverse event where you're not operating business as usual, do your contingency plans, do your workarounds, still maintain the integrity of your information security expectations or your information security controls. And you can think about how a lot of that kind of integrates or segues back to some of the other controls we've already talked about. Very common workaround or business continuity approach these days is remote working or teleworking. So you were required several controls ago to have a teleworking policy to deal with information security. So hopefully this will tie up any loose ends that might not have been covered, but that's the intent. When you can't operate as usual, you want to be sure you can still maintain information security requirements.
Now, Tim, you mentioned that NQA also certifies to ISO 23000. Was that the number?
Close, 22301, 22301.
Okay, sorry. And so that would be a business continuity management system, and whether or not somebody certifies to that, that would have excellent advice and guidance on the types of things that should be in place under domain 17, correct?
Exactly, yeah. So if you kind of wanted to become a student of business continuity, 22301, which is the requirements document, or as you alluded to as a guidance document, 22313, 313 would be the guidance document for the business continuity management system.
Hope I'm not stepping on you. Okay. Domain 18 for compliance. If I stepped on you, I'm sorry. I just couldn't hear you, and I hope people can continue to hear me. The domain 18 is for compliance, and that means legal compliance as well as compliance with independent review of your management system. So you have, for example, an accredited certification body to do your independent review if you want to achieve certification. Now, if you were doing just using this for your own business purposes, you might have independent review by somebody who's not an accredited certification body, such as, the DESARA group could come in and do an audit and point out where you've got areas that don't meet the standard, but that would not be a certification unless you go through a certification body, and you really need to go with an accredited one, which Tim will talk about a little bit later on. Review of the management system includes your management review and the technical compliance review, but on the legal side, we talked previously about supplier relationships, and you may have contracts with your suppliers and contracts with your customers as well. So your business, these controls talk about knowing what applies. For example, protection of records or intellectual property rights, personal information, and we talked about encryption a while ago, cryptography, so that all of compliance with all those rules are in place. And domain 18 is the last of the 14 controls. Remember, back over, now that you've seen what all those controls are, the domains that are covered, and a little bit of a flavor of what each of those sections does for your company, the point is that when you've got an information asset that needs to be protected, you would use those various methods that are described in Annex A, the 14 domains, to protect your assets against the vulnerabilities that you know of. And you don't just put one lock and key over an asset, you have multiple. So you have your physical controls, your network controls, your password controls, your personnel competency controls. All of those things add together to make a fabric of Kevlar, if you will, that protects your information assets from unauthorized access. The point being, you want to ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and reduce your risk of any of your assets being exposed or unavailable or rendered useless due to their integrity being changed without authorization. So the controls are the building blocks that help you implement your overall policy and achieve your objectives. And it's different from other standards in that while each one of those controls may be just a short line, a couple of lines, maybe 50 words at the most, they do have a big impact on what your business actually does to protect your assets. So we've covered what the standard says, and the next section is to talk about how you go about achieving certification. When the DESARA group works with a company, we do the planning and implementation parts side by side with you and get you right up to the point of being ready for your certification audit. In phase one, what we do is work with you to get management acceptance. Or often it's the managers who come to us at first and say, is this something we need to do? What's it going to cost us? How long is it going to take? And when management has decided that pursuing certification or compliance with a management system standard is what they're going to do, the next steps that we lead them through are to identify a core team, which would be those key asset owners from IT and legal and HR and the main functions of the business that have access to sensitive information, as well as an executive sponsor who can interface with all the different groups and remove the roadblocks to implementation. We take that core team and take them through a training program where they establish the scope and the statement of applicability and do a desktop level gap assessment of where do we stand against these different controls and requirements of the standard. And then we work with our client on project planning. How long will it take to, and who's going to be responsible for what to implement the management system? Now we have a 2-day program. We can make it 3 days depending if there are more people and you want to get a jump start on the work, just for getting that management acceptance. But once acceptance is decided, I recommend you start with either our 5-day or 8-day launch workshop program, where 5 days you've got deep dive into what does the standard require, and 8 days you get more work on actually beginning to implement the management system. But if you're doing it yourself, the important thing is to understand what the standard requires right off the bat, and don't go down the rabbit holes of over-controlling or certainly not under-controlling what you need to in order to protect your information. But that would be in phase 2, actually doing the implementation. The heavy lifting of phase 2 in implementation is to define which controls apply and actually implement them. Look at the guidance from ISO 27002, as well as the expertise of your information security professionals inside the company, and write up how you will apply that control to affect your information security. And you may need to create additional system documentation, such as maybe an internal audit procedure or a risk treatment plan procedure. There are a number of procedures that need to be that need to be written and followed, as well as some documented information that follows along with the controls. Another piece of heavy lifting in implementation is inventorying your information assets that you need to control. So you say, well, what do we have? We have reports, we have financial information, we have our computers, and so forth. You list all the different kinds of assets, classification. What are we going to do about those risks? Which controls are we going to apply voluntarily or contractually? We've got a customer contract or maybe even a legal requirement to apply some controls. As you begin implementing all those various changes in phase 2, you begin educating your staff and getting them used to using what the controls say, and get them used to using the incident management system. So that was one of the things that came out of that company that issued the wrong badges to us when we walked in. I reminded them as a member of the internal audit team at the end of the day about their incident management system, and made a note that it hadn't been followed as of that day. I mean, I didn't have a record of it as of that day, and nobody told me they would have entered, would have called the help desk and entered the incident into the management system. But it needs to begin to be exercised during implementation phase. You can't wait and say, oh, we'll do this once everything's perfect. Get people used to, if you see something, say something early on, and it'll strengthen your system. Plan on taking about a year, unless you're already way ahead of the curve on your information security, to implement ISO 27001. Then when we move into phase 3, this is where you verify that your system meets the requirements, meets all your internal as well as standard, as well as external customer and legal requirements. And you would do your internal audits and have a full management review, which place. And then you turn it over to your certification body to come on and do your certification audits. But I didn't mention it up front in the planning phase. In the planning phase or early in the implementation, you should begin choosing a certification body, an accredited certification body, and getting on their calendar. And I'll turn over the certification part to Tim to talk about how NQA works certification. Tim?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. So yeah, as Karen mentioned, obviously the longer legwork, the longer lead time is on the implementation side, but there is that overlap because frankly, the resources for these audits are relatively scarce. So sometime prior to you being fully implemented, you do want to start engaging with a certification body and mapping out or planning the audits, at least to get up to your certification date. What NQA offers is what a lot of other certifications would kind of model after. We offer a gap assessment, which is an optional activity, and then all accredited certification bodies should have the stage 1, stage 2 audit cadence to it. And the certification ultimately comes as a recommendation after stage 2. So this is kind of showing a potential map of how that might work. As I mentioned, the gap assessment, optional. It's really meant to be kind of a off-the-record activity for the organization to get familiar with the process, maybe focus on certain areas, and leave kind of a laundry list of to-dos. Regardless of whether a gap assessment occurs, the stage 1 audit would typically be several months prior to you wanting to have the full-up stage 2 audit. Its focus is to look at the structure of the ISMS that's been built, understand those controls that were implemented or selected, and probably more importantly, understand the controls that were deemed not to be selected or not applicable, and kind of dig through the justification or understand the reasoning why those weren't controlled. So stage 1 is largely kind of an office or desktop-based activity, typically on site. And the focus team there, I think, would be that core team that Karen kind of alluded to, whereas the gap assessment might be the core team plus for any particular processes that would be sampled. But then when you get to stage 2, that's pretty much everybody, because that's where the implementation is going to be reviewed from soup to nuts. So expect that to be a fairly lengthy audit. Generally speaking, ISMS audits are longer than QMS audits. Depending on the size of the organization, an ISMS audit, probably the shortest you're going to see is 3 to 4 days for a stage 2, upwards of 10 to even 20 days for the largest of organizations. I wouldn't expect that for most organizations, but they are heavier as a rule than the 9001 audits. Stage 2, again, the goal to look at the entire implementation, so all the requirements, all the controls will be gone through. Therefore, the applicable people, process owners, implementers, people that need to be aware of it, those are all kind of subject to the audit for their part. And again, that would typically occur anywhere from a month to maybe 3 months after the stage 1. Certainly, you want to have your system fully implemented before you have the stage 1 occur. And the end result of that is the recommendation. And we'll talk about that with the next slide in terms of what happens from there, or sorry, the next after this one. But first off, Just a couple of things about management system audits in case folks aren't familiar with them. Number one, that they're not meant to be 100% inspections. So even in a handful of days, we'll cover a lot of stuff, but we're not going to see everything in every artifact or every bit of objective evidence. So it is a bit of a sampling, and the goal is to confirm that there's a system in place, that information security management system is in place. We do that through a sampling of people, of artifacts, of processes, and confirm that it's in place, it meets the requirements of the standard, and that it's being operated on a regular basis. Another thing that 27001 or any management system audits really should not be is subjective. It really should not be what does the auditor want, or what's their preference, or what they like to see. It really does need to be very objective. As we've read through a couple examples of the requirements of the controls, the standard says you shall do something. It gets pretty vague in terms of how you would do that, so that's where the organization fills in the details perhaps. But at the end of the day, the auditor and the audit needs to be objective based on that requirement and objective evidence of that requirement either being met or not being met. As we've alluded to, and hopefully that's come clear now, 27001 audits at least are not only about IT, they're not only about hardware and software. It is that holistic approach, a lot of process, a lot of people involved, and again, certainly the auditees will be not just the IT folks, but throughout the organization. And then last, but certainly not least, 27001 audit, again, any management system audit really, should not be a one-way street. This kind of goes part and parcel with the fact that it's not meant to be an inspection. It really is best when it's served up as a dialogue where the organization is familiar and understands why they've implemented the policies and controls they have and can kind of speak to them or defend them as the case may be. So it's always best when the organization is willing to talk and have that dialogue with the auditor. It becomes a much more effective event when it's a two-way street. So the certification process, following that stage 2 activity, that final bit, certifications generally are valid for 3 years, but they do require surveillance audits in the intervening years. So if you were certified in, this is 2018, I guess, you would expect to have a surveillance audit in 2019, another surveillance audit in 2020, and then cycle back around to a recertification audit in the 3rd year, 2021, in a case of our example. Surveillances generally are going to be shorter than that initial audit. They're generally going to have some additional level of sampling where not every control will be audited, not every requirement may be audited. But then when you get to that 3-year recertification, that's going to be more akin to the stage 2, where it is a more holistic, comprehensive look of all the controls, all the requirements, really reconfirming that the system remains in place after those 3 years. And the outcome of that being a new 3-year certification, and the cycle starts all over again. So we kind of used up our time, and then some. But real briefly, if you were down this path, going down this path, why might you consider NQA? Well, hopefully, for one, we've kind of given a little bit about our philosophy in terms of how we've presented on this standard. But as we've talked about before, having an accredited certification body is very important. NQA holds A and AB accreditation, which is the U.S. accreditation body here in the U.S. Along with, we also hold UCAS accreditation for our European counterparts. We've been in the business for a good number of years, and we hope to be around for as many years, if not more. It's always good to understand the audit stable and the locations that you've got, because as I said, these resources are somewhat scarce, so you want to make sure that you're going to get a good service approach. And from our perspective at NQA, we do all this through the U.S. operations. So if you're a U.S.-based company, your 27,000 audits will be managed, will be reviewed. All that information, frankly, stays resident in the U.S., and the whole program is run here as well. So that's a little bit more about NQA.
Well, thanks, Tim. And I want to say something about NQA as well before we move on. But first, I'll just say that we are over time, but I'd be happy to stay on the line as long as it takes to answer questions that come up. So if you're on the line and anything about certification or implementation or what the standard itself or the controls require, please go ahead and enter that on the questions tab on your control panel. What I want to say about NQA is that NQA and DESARA Group are completely separate entities. There's no financial relationship between the companies, but we do run into each other with their clients use us, and we have clients who use, who choose to use NQA, and we have been very impressed with the quality of the auditors that NQA puts out there. I believe Tim is involved in the education and training of his auditors on ISO 27001 and other standards, and your auditor is really the face of NQA to you for most people, except for those people who are dealing with the office on scheduling and so forth. Having that strong stable of competent auditors is really a strength that that NQA brings, as well as being accredited and operating all around the world. It's a recognized name, so that you can count on them to be for your customers or anyone who looks at your certificate to be able to recognize you haven't gone with a fly-by-night or done some sort of self-certification. Now, the DESARA Group's role in your certification journey would be to guide and accelerate your development. We've consulted with dozens of implementation teams across several different standards, and we all have over 20 years of experience in the industry. So what we do is come in and help you streamline the implementation to reduce the time and expense. Yes, it costs something to have DESARA come in, but the biggest expense of implementing a management system is the time and attention of your own people and the changes that you need to make over a period of time. So if we can work with you to ensure that you move through your implementation plan with all due speed and not shortcut anything or miss any steps, then we hope to ensure that your first time audit certification with minimal non-conformances. And so if you are moving forward with ISO 27001, a recommendation from Tim and from the DESARA Group is to study ISO 27001 using things like our various webinars and articles that both companies offer for free. And also the DESARA Group offers public and virtual classroom public classes, and we can come on site to your own business where we can get into the specifics of how you work. Like I said, the 2, 3, 5, and 8-day workshops, whatever works best for your organization. And after you've studied ISO 27001, do an assessment of yourself to see where do you stand against the standard so far, and then work with management. When and why and how is this important to your business? Go through the planning, implementation, and ultimately certification isn't the end goal, it's the starting line to your ongoing improvement to information security management systems. And with that, I'd like to open it up to questions if any have come in. And let's see, I don't believe I've seen anything come in. There's one question here, and it says, how do we appropriately scale the requirements to our smaller company? That's a good question that we is answered through, and Tim, I'll take a stab at it, and then I'd like you to as well. Obviously, the kinds of controls that a small company has are not going to be the same that, say, Microsoft or Amazon or somebody would have over their systems. So what ISO 27001 requires you to do is make an inventory of the information assets that you intend to protect. What is it that's important to your business to address confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information? And then from there, once you decide what your list of assets is, you do a risk assessment of the threats and vulnerabilities of those assets. So a smaller company scales automatically. You have fewer assets, and you probably have lower level of threats and vulnerabilities of your assets. But once you determine what those are, there will be some that stick out as this is where we're most vulnerable to a breach. And that's when you get to decide, what is our risk appetite? How far are we willing to go to say we'll take that risk because the cost of correcting it would be so much more than the damage it would do to our company? For example, a very small company might say, you know what, if we have this would be ridiculous, but they could say, you know what, if we have a security breach, we're done. We're going out of business. We're just going to close up. That would be probably the worst case scenario of accepting risks. But you're no doubt somewhere north of that in terms of your risk tolerance. And you'd say, well, at this level, we're not going to spend more than $100,000 to correct risks because that's what the value of our information is, or you come up with some way of determining which addresses which level of risk you're willing to tolerate. And then also you have to look at how big are the threats to your assets. Okay, so if it's very unlikely that someone's going to get to your assets and create a problem for you, that's one of the ways that a smaller company may be able to scale the requirements, is the threats simply aren't as high and you don't have to take as many mitigating measures. Tim, do you want to address that?
Yeah, and I certainly agree that by design, any of these standards, 27001 included, is meant to be scalable. Really, again, by virtue of the brevity in the requirements. So the standard says you need to do these things, but it doesn't say how you need to do them. So that's where the kind of beauty of it comes. Yeah, a bigger organization may kind of over-engineer a more complex process, whereas a smaller organization can engineer a simpler or more efficient one. To your point about risk treatment, yeah, the standard does talk about, that there may be some residual risk, and right, that might be different for smaller organizations that may scale automatically. So I think that's a valid point as well. But I guess the big takeaway I would say is make sure you don't over-engineer or overbuild your system. If you are a small organization, build it to fit.
Yeah, and that's one of the ways that when I said DESARA streamlines and accelerates your implementation of a management system, not doing too much all at once is an important way that you would scale for a smaller business, but doing the right amount if you're a larger business is also important. You wouldn't want to, for example, if you have a multi-site business, only certify, for example, the headquarters, with no plans of going further than that if there are risks apparent at other facilities. So deciding how much of your business to include in scope is another way that a company would scale the business, scale the management system. And you need to bite off a big enough chunk that it actually addresses the needs of protecting your information assets. Okay, with that, I'd like to thank Tim Woodcomb and our assistant who's been in the background, Mariah Krupowitz, making sure all the mailings went out. You will get a recording link for this tomorrow, and we hope that you'll watch your mail for offerings of courses, articles, additional webinars. And by the way, when you get your mailer back about the link, or if you'd like to just send me some information right now, we'd be very interested, Tim and I and the rest of my team, his team, in what you'd like to hear more about in the future about ISO 27001 or related management system standards. And we'll make every attempt over the coming months to address where the needs of the audience are most of all. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and I look forward to having you on our future webinars and courses. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.